Welcome into another episode of They've Got Now. I'm really excited to be joined today by someone who is obviously making waves in a front office now after making waves as a basketball player herself. It's Morgan Tuck from, of course, University of Connecticut over at the Connecticut Sun. Morgan, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for inviting me on. And how are you doing?
I'm good. I can't complain. A lot of the stuff I do is centered around like scouting in the draft. So yesterday was kind of like the day
Yep.
where you just like sit back and like I had a lot of like intel on what was going to happen and ideas of where things would shake out, but still had some surprises in there. So
Yeah. It's
uh,
always interesting, and especially like you do all this preparation, the scouting throughout the year, and you get very, I think, like set on what you think about a
yes.
player or like what you think a team needs. So it's always interesting to see kind of how it plays out. So yesterday was pretty fun.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting because exactly like you're saying. I, yeah, I had all of my ideas on where I felt things would
Yeah.
shake out and how I would go, and then so seeing it actually happen, like, oh wow, okay, somebody
Yep.
thinks very differently than I do.
Yep.
But
For
that's the
sure.
fun part of the game. I feel like you can go in so many directions.
Yeah.
As an interesting side note, are you aware that somebody broke your Illinois playoff single postseason run scoring record this year?
Really? That's
Yes, it only
awesome. I
took a
didn't know that.
decade, but yeah.
No, that's dope. I actually I think that's pretty cool. I'll have to look it up and check out whoever did that. That's
Yeah,
cool.
it's Aubrey Galvin. I don't remember what school she's at, but she's
Okay.
tough. Expect her. I think she's a 2025, but
Okay.
um
I'm gonna look her up for sure.
yeah,
That's awesome.
she's really good. But no, exactly. Like I was in Notre Dame at Notre Dame working on a project and randomly they were showing the Illinois State playoffs in Indiana. I have no idea why, but was
Okay.
watching that and they announced that and that's why I hit up Alexander to do this because like, all right, I got to talk to Morgan because
Nice.
you're only I think 3 years older than me, but the wealth of experience you've had already is just like it's pretty insane when you think about it.
Mhm.
Number one, especially with the draft being yesterday, you were drafted 8 years ago. So like
Yeah.
is have you kind of was there like a little bit of an inflection point for you now? Like this was like your first like after coming off your first full season being in a front office, your first full prep year for a draft. It kind of hit you a little bit yesterday, like, damn, like we've been around it for a minute.
Yeah, and this actually was second year of being assistant GM, but definitely the first year I think of as involved in,
Yeah.
really having like from the season and all that. And I think this year, especially like coming off the Final Four, like this time of the year was always so exciting and like everything you look forward to. And then I'm like, dang, like that was 8 years ago that I got drafted. But I think it's really cool and it's interesting. My mom had like texted me yesterday and was like, 8 years ago you were up there and now you're here helping make a decision. So it's like I feel like even though that 8 years went by super fast, it is kind of surreal at times to think about like, you know, at that time when I got drafted, I didn't think that I would be here 8 years later. And
Yeah.
I think it's really funny that now on our team, we have Rachel Banham, who in my draft class was
Yeah,
the
she went
fourth
right
pick.
after you, right? Yeah.
Yeah, Mo Jefferson, which is my college teammate, she went right before me. We have Tiffany Mitchell, who I think was like the ninth pick. So it's like that 8 years and kind of it's just weird sometimes seeing it for like I'm in the front office, but then I have players on our team that were like right there with me, right? We were going through orientation and all that stuff. So it's just pretty cool to see that my perspective has definitely changed, but I think it's pretty cool that I get to be on the other side of it.
Yeah. And when you talk about the perspective shift too, like, how does that kind of work for you? Like, what was that like? Because I know obviously, from talking to you before, I know that you kind of got a head start on being prepared to be, not a basketball player because you dealt with
Yeah.
so many injuries. And so like, what was that adjustment period like coming over? Because exactly like you're saying, like,
Yeah.
Mariah, who you guys won 4 national titles together, and now she's gonna be playing for you guys. Like,
Yeah.
how do you kind of sit with that? Because it's got to be definitely a little bit different.
Oh, it's very different. And I tell players all the time, like, enjoy your playing days, like, because it's not saying afterward is just like terrible, right? Like, it's not that, but it's very different. Being a player, I think your perspective is one way and kind of how you view things. And it's what you've done your whole life. And you've like dedicated your life to a game that you're still playing. Even with the injuries, it's like you miss it, but you're coming back to play.
Hmm.
And so, I think when I retired, I wasn't really expecting it. I didn't want to retire. I mean, I think I was a little bit in denial, to be honest. I think I
Yeah.
knew I
How
needed
can
to
you not be?
retire.
Like,
Yeah, and I like pushed it. Like I got to the point where it was like I physically couldn't play at the level that I needed to. So I was like, well, I don't really have another option. So I think that helped where I don't feel like, because people ask me all the time, oh, would you go back to play? I'm like, yeah, if my knees weren't so bad, I would, but like I physically can't, right? So that helped where I didn't feel like there was another option. But I'll say it's very different, like what I consider now like having a grown-up job and like a real job, or like I think I remember the first thing when I started was like, I was like, how do people work all day without taking a nap? Like, how are people
Yeah,
just so like how do you do this every day? And people were like, yeah, you don't take naps all the time when you work at an office and stuff like that. So I think sometimes it's as a player, I think your perspective is a little bit smaller in the sense of like what everyone else does. Or like I think the biggest thing is I have such a greater appreciation for all the people throughout my basketball career that like were behind the scenes or that did the scheduling or made sure that the arena was set up or people were in the stands. Where like as a player, you don't think about that literally at all. Never crosses your mind the people that are working all day to make your life easier. So I think that has made me really grateful for all the people that have done that. And I think, at the same time, yes, I wish I could still be out there playing and not necessarily in the office, but I'm very grateful for the timing because obviously we have to retire. Everyone has to retire at some point, right? It doesn't matter where you are in your life. So I'm thankful that the timing worked out because I ended up where I did. With the Sun, I think I landed pretty well. And now I feel like, I can kind of get started on that second career, which I would have had to anyway. So I feel like, all right, maybe I get a little bit of a head start than some of my counterparts that are still playing. But I think overall, I think outside looking in, it seemed like a really seamless transition. Internally, it was a little rough at times, and I still feel like I'm in the transition, but I'm definitely finding my way and feeling comfortable in it. So I think if I went back, I would change it, but now I don't think I would. I think how it's happened has been the best way for me, for sure.
definitely. A couple things off that because number one, on the nap part, I totally agree. Like even now, like I still am trying to figure that out because like I don't know, like I know so many people who are like, where I want to get to, or are like in doing similar things, but they just have more experience with it. And I'm like, how do
Mm-hmm.
you do all this with the same 24 hours? And I'm
I
like, I feel
swear.
like that's like the thing that always comes up to me because I'm like, I feel like I figured everything out except for sleep because I just don't know how to like create any kind of consistent sleep schedule. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
It's
figure
tough.
that
And it's
one out
like,
eventually, but it's like,
it's so tough. Or like when we talk to like younger players or prospects, they're like, what do you like to some of them like, oh, I love to sleep. And I'm like, oh, I wish like I used to. Now it's like, you know what? If I get the sleep, I do. If not, it is what it
yeah.
is. So I
Especially
feel
when you have to
that.
keep up with like, if you're trying to keep up with like the international schedule in the off season, like, well, okay,
Yeah,
well, you got to be up at 9 a.m. to make sure you catch the first game. And then,
exactly.
that adjusts your entire schedule around that too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so funny, like you mentioned too, or I guess not funny, but just coincidental. Like I didn't get to your same level as an athlete, but I was working on being a pro boxer. And exactly like you're talking about, I think like kind of the figuring out process after your body's like, well, let's, we can't do
Yeah.
this anymore. It's like, well, you
Yep.
spend time trying to still make it happen, and then it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't happen. It's like, oh, well, okay. So, kind of figuring out that pivot is really difficult. Was there like
Yeah.
a moment for you that really stuck with like, okay, it's time to make the transition, or when you maybe most felt most comfortable about making that happen?
Yeah, it was actually I had my last season was the bubble season
Hmm.
in 2020, and I knew I wasn't going to go overseas. My knees had been like really declining the kind of that year before. So I was like, all right. And I had done, I've had a bunch of surgeries, and so I was trying out stem cells. And the bubble season was weird. We didn't know if we were going to have a season. We didn't know when it was going to start. So I was supposed to be going overseas to get this stem cell treatment, but couldn't go because I didn't have enough recovery time. So I pivoted and did like a more local stem cell treatment. Really, just like trying anything. I did the bubble season. I like barely made it through that. So I'm thankful that I got to thankful for Seattle. That I got to
Hmm.
be with that team. And then after the season, I did go overseas, did my stem cells, and then I was in recovery. Like I was in rehab for like 3-ish months, 3-4 months. I was actually feeling pretty good. I was like, whoa, this is the best my knees have felt in some years. And then all of a sudden it was like, what happened? Something's going on. I go get it checked out. I have like the worst bone bruise I've ever had. And I had a bunch of bone bruises that was just like a normal thing. But they said, oh, you need at least 8 weeks. And that would have taken me to training camp. So I was like, you know what? I gotta try this out. I gotta test it, right? Like it's not gonna work if I do that. So I did a couple workouts where I did one like full hour individual, And the next morning I could like barely move and like my knee was like a balloon. But I said I have to be able to go and shoot because right, training camp, you don't get a day off
Mhm.
after an hour practice. So I went and I knew in that workout, I knew it was done. Like I knew my knee was it was at its limit. I knew it wasn't worth putting myself through as much pain that I was in to be able to play a game I loved, but it was making me feel terrible, like so much pain and stuff. So I knew in that workout, I think my parents knew, like they came to watch me work out, which I was like, well, I don't know. It was years since my parents came to a workout. And then after the workout, me and my parents went back to my house and I talked about it and told them. And then like, I think I knew it. Like I knew inside, like I can't push it anymore the way that I was. Like I have to be able to like walk and go up and down stairs and like do
Mhm.
stuff. So I think that's when I made the decision, was just like with my parents of like, yeah, this is it. I've tried everything that I can. But it sucked and I didn't want to make it. But then like I reached out to kind of like my, Coach Gino, my high school coach, like really pivotal people, like some of my teammates, just to like let them know. And then like a few days later, I made an announcement and all that good stuff. So it, I think I knew in my mind, probably like a couple years before that, this might be coming to an end, but I wasn't
Mhm.
willing to accept it. So I feel like I was forced to accept it a little bit. But I'm sure when you feel like your body is like failing you a little bit, that's kind of how I felt. So I like struggled with this like, but why me, right? Like, why does my knees have to be this bad? Like, why can't I do it? And then like and then of course I'm 6'2", I'm tall, I stand out. So then every 2 seconds, someone's like, oh, do you play basketball? And then I'm like,
Yeah.
well, I did, and get all emotional and all this stuff. So it was like a rough kind of like month or so, I'd say, kind of dealing with it. And then I was like, I gotta get a job, right? Like I gotta work. I gotta figure this out. I didn't have something lined up. But literally like a week or so after I made my announcement, one of the owners, we're owned by the Mohegan tribe, literally called me and was like, hey, we just hired Jen Rosati, our president. We're in this whole rebuild. And they asked if I'd be interested in the position. So like the timing really, really worked out well. And so it was like such a rough moment, but then I think it turned into like a really great opportunity that wouldn't have came across if I didn't retire. So it was like it sucked, but it ended up working out pretty quick. So I shouldn't complain too much.
Yeah. No, it's like I don't know. I don't think it is complaining at all because like I just think exactly what you're talking about. Like when you're doing something and you're working for it, that's like your entire life, dude. Like, how do you
Yeah.
having to like take less than a year to kind of figure out what that looks like and moving away from that is hard.
Yeah.
Like and I think kind of going off what you're saying too, one of the things I always try and like impart to people, because I think at least like maybe like diehard fans get it, but I think for casual fans, so often people think like, oh, well, you're getting paid to play the game. And I'm like, yes, but really what you're getting paid for is the 90% of the time that you're not on the
Mhm.
court because
Yeah.
exactly like you're talking about, like it's, you can perform in the moment, but it's like, okay, well, all my prep work is harder. Like going out and
Hmm.
running 5 or 6 miles is way harder than it used to be. Like
Yeah.
going out and, just being able to lay on the couch without it hurting is a lot harder than it used to be. Like that's the stuff that is so difficult to like
Yeah.
sit with. And I think is what like to me, I think that's the stuff that just always puts into perspective how crazy somebody like AT is to me. Like,
Hmm.
because I think, watching AT practice, knowing how she approaches things, um, like when, like, I don't know, to me, dealing with my own stuff and seeing how things have gone for other people too, it just puts into perspective how insane it is to be one of the 4 or 5 best players on the planet because, like,
It's
the consistency is crazy. And I think people don't have a great enough appreciation for that.
Yeah, and I think it's really a mindset. And I think someone like AT, I think her mindset is very unique in the way that she views the game, she
Mhm.
approaches the game. And I think she's one, she puts her all into it no matter what, whether she's playing here, playing overseas. Like she's a special type of player because there's not many players or I think people that have that type of mindset. But like you said, I think that's you look at athlete, I mean, not obviously every athlete doesn't have like a ton of physical issues or whatever, right? But like
Mhm.
athletes, you dedicate your mind, your body, your lifestyle, like family away from families, missing holidays, like you're really committed, like I don't know. I mean, obviously, yes, like we have to like take care of school and stuff growing up, right? Would I say I cared as much about it as basketball? No, right? But you had to do it.
Yeah.
But I think when you look at like, well, at least what I thought about when I retired, because of course it's like time of reflection and thinking back over your career. I think where it's hard for athletes or like where I feel like I was having this like low key identity crisis because you've dedicated like your entire life to one thing, right? Or like to one sport or one element where you've kind of like wrapped your mind around it. You know, we're not like it makes you who you are, but like I can't imagine who I would be if I didn't have basketball in my life from when I was a kid growing up. So I think when you have to kind of like let it go after you've committed so much, I just think it causes a little bit of like friction in your brain where you're like, or even like if there's a disconnect between like your mind might feel like, look, I can still do it, I can still get out there, but your body's like, no, like you're done. You know, so
Yeah.
I think that part is hard. And I do appreciate, I hated that, you know, I had all the injuries that I had. I ended up having 7 knee surgeries over my time and all these treatments, but it made it though for me that I didn't feel like I had a choice, which I think was helpful. Where I think if it was where, you know, or like when people say like, oh, when people come out of retirement, I totally get why people would do that. Like I can 100% understand it.
Yeah.
So at least I do appreciate that. Like, I don't feel like that's an option for me because like I can't run really. So it's like, all right, even if I wanted to get out there, if I got engaged, it doesn't matter. I can't play. So I think that helped it make it a little bit more definitive for me, which I think has helped me move past it a little bit.
Definitely. You know, like we just mentioned with AT though, like in terms of talking about your perspective shift and the way that you've seen everything, like obviously she was there when you got drafted to
Mm-hmm.
Connecticut. I believe well, I mean, obviously you got drafted there with Rachel, but like she's been there the entire time. So, you know,
Yep.
getting to going from practicing with her, playing with her for what, 4 years, and
4 years.
then
Yeah.
getting to see her still doing this and seeing the level of player that she's become. How has your perspective of her as maybe a player or person changed since, you know, transitioning over to being in the front office?
Yeah, I think she was always someone that I looked up to. I played behind her for 4 years, right?
Yeah.
Like she was the starting four. I was right behind. So going against her every day and just seeing, and one thing I always appreciated was she was always willing to be helpful, right? Like in practice or showing, giving me little tidbits, or if I had a question, whatever, like she was always really good at doing that. And so I think obviously, and I got to watch her in college and how she played. So I think I appreciate that I've been able to kind of see this evolution of her career and how she was so good, right? Like she was really good in college. She's really good as a pro, but I think she has continued to improve and continue to be more effective. And she plays very unique, right? There's not another player in our league that plays the way that AT does. And she is, what I give her a ton of credit and respect for is that she has found a way to be effective, even if she's a little bit unorthodox in her approach, or especially now where it's like, the positionless basketball where everybody has to be able to shoot. Everyone has to be outside, and she doesn't, right? Like everyone knows AT is not shooting it from outside, but she finds a way. And I think she's also, her mentality, like I mentioned, I think is different. Where like it's like, or even if you see her get knocked on the floor, she pops up so quick. Like
Hmm.
sometimes I'm like, dang, until you could take a second, like catch your breath. It's like she never gets tired. And I'm sure maybe she feels tired at some time. I don't know because you can't tell. So I think my perspective of like, as a player, you appreciate it, you know, because you know she's going to go super hard. Like she's going to play hard on defense. She's going to do the right thing. But then now in the front office, it's like you really realize like her willpower to just play that way and how she plays, it really makes a difference. I think if you saw her, especially last year, to me showed that with Bree Jones tearing her Achilles and going down, right? That was a big piece that we were missing. So it's like between her and Duana Bonner, like having to do even more. But I do think AT's kind of like will to win, right? Like her want to win games and to be effective. That I think that plays as much of a part as her physical ability. So I think it's just a ton of respect for her and credit because, you know, she wasn't always as effective as she is. And I think you see a lot of players as they get older kind of decline, and she hasn't, you know, so she's been able to sustain something really, really good. And just she keeps getting better. So I'm just, especially on this side, excited to see kind of like what she does this year and how it
Yeah.
goes. And is she going to be even better? And to come off of a year like last year, I think, you know, kind of the sky's the limit for her.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because like I just love watching basketball periods. So like whenever I have free time, I go back and watch old stuff that I never
Mm.
got to see. So like, you know, I've gone back and watched a ton of stuff from like the 2010s in college to get like a better idea of like, all
Yeah.
right, well, I can see where this player's at now, but like, where were they at when they
Yeah.
were a prospect? And like, so seeing AT at Maryland compared to now, and even like early Connecticut is so different because like you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
like, um, I think everything's just so refined in her game now in a different way. And like I think in some ways, like obviously she would be like a high level impact player regardless, but I think the way that the game has started to adjust last couple of years has been like the best possible thing for her and where her
Yeah.
game's headed because like she doesn't shoot like you mentioned, but like she might be like the quickest decision maker in the league. Like the way she sees things,
Yep.
knows where it's going to be, knows how to make reads. Like it just, she's like a basketball supercomputer in some ways.
Yeah.
And I feel like, especially the way that like Steph built the offense around that, like it just, it fits and it makes sense. And
That's,
it's very hurt.
yep.
Um,
I agree with you 100%.
yeah. So, talking about the draft too now, obviously you guys had a pretty good class come in last night.
Mhm.
Um, Now, especially talking about the player perspective as well, like obviously you were a high level player for a long time. You've watched film for forever. But how has maybe the way that you like digest things or break things down or approach things changed since becoming, part of the front office?
Yeah, I think you weigh more options, when you look at a player. I think when you're a player, you obviously watch other players, but a lot of when you start looking at the individual is like what you get on your scout, right? That the
Hmm.
coaches are putting in front of you. If it's like where you're younger, it's maybe more of like the plays and schemes and what they're running or their defense. But then as you get a little bit older in pro, it's looking at their tendencies, what they like to do. If they go left, do they pull up? If they go right, do they try to get all the way to the rim, right? Like looking at all those little things. And so, but you really look at more of what's presented to you, right? Or
Yeah.
like what's the focus, right? I think now on this side, it's a little bit more of a holistic view where you really obviously evaluate them on the court and what our GM Darius calls like the eye test, right? Like you can watch a player and know if they're pretty good, right? I think we all can see that, or if they've kind of got it a little bit more than someone else. But then it's like now we're diving into analytics and we're looking at all these different numbers, which luckily we have such an amazing business intelligence analytics person, James Hyman. He's really, really good
He's very
because
smart.
he
Yeah.
takes all the numbers and makes it like English for the rest of us to understand what's going on. But I think you're looking at so much detail, so much data to try to put together a piece of a player, but then also the off court piece or like when you talk to their coaches, or it might be their dobo or one of the managers, right? Like you're really trying to build this like holistic view of a person, because there are so many great players, right? Like there's so many, and there's so many players that could be in the league that will never be in the league. So it's like you have to try to find those little things to help separate. And so I think now I definitely look at the game a little bit more in not so specific all the time, but a little bit more general, because it's obviously like you want, the best players and the ones that are skilled, but then you also have to think about how are they going to fit with your team? How are they going to fit the culture? And, how is this going to mesh? It's just a little bit more, or I won't say a little bit, it's a lot more detail, I think, that you think about and go through when you're not on the player side. Because as a player, you're just trying to do what's going to help your team win or help you guard that person or find your spots on offense, where now it's not so specific to me, but it's how is it going to affect all of our players? How is it going to affect our staff? How is it going to affect the organization? So I think it's just, you have to weigh a lot more options when you're looking at players, and considering who you're going to bring into your organization.
Yeah, it's so funny because like when I was younger, I used to just think like everything could be solved with talent or like doing
Yeah.
something like, a certain way. And obviously not the case, but like, the older I get, I think the more I realize like it's just all gray area. Like
Mm-hmm.
everything is so context dependent and it just depends
Yep.
on who, what, where, when. And like that's part of why I'm so fascinated like talking to, like I feel like a coach and a GM have like such different perspective on things. Like a coach can like we'll look at a player and be like, well, like look at the way that they attack the offensive glass. Like I could see that fitting right away. I'm like, okay, well, what if they don't have the same kind of upside or something?
Yeah.
Like, it's like that
Yeah.
kind of thing. So it's so different how things can be approached and looked at.
For sure.
Um,
Very subjective at times, for sure. It
yeah.
is.
So with respect to Layla, who you guys drafted 10th overall yesterday, first and foremost, one of my favorite players in the draft. Like, I watched her first at U19 last year, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if you saw her U19. U19 was just like nuts. She had a blast there. But she has just like a ton of swagger in her game, like very much
Mm-hmm.
has like the French league.
Yep.
Like I think the way I've tried to explain her to people, obviously not the exact same player, but has some of that same like Marine Johannes
Mm-hmm.
flair and flash to her game. What was maybe the first thing you saw from her that kind of put you onto her?
I think, I mean, it was definitely a group effort, but I think when I
Yeah.
first watched her, I think her athleticism, she's really young, but I think when you look at someone and kind of the way that they move and their athleticism, like you can see how she's a little bit separate from a
Hmm.
lot of other players, right? And that she has something that could translate, I think, to the league. But she's, or what, one of our assistant coaches, Austin Kelly, he always says, like, she's a stud. Like, she's
Yeah.
good. Like, you can watch her and like, ooh, she's going to be really, really good. And I think to see her as a young player being as effective as she is and the way that she plays and that swagger and confidence that she kind of exudes, it's like you can only imagine what she's going to be like in a couple years when she like gets a little bit older and more closer to the age of players that are in the league that usually come from here. So I think she's a really exciting player because I think she's already really good, but I think she has a ton of potential. And at least from what we've learned about her and heard from, like, that she's bought into doing the work to reach that potential. So I think she's someone that's just, she's really exciting. And I think, I know a lot of people, if they're not like really tuned in, they might not see her play, right? So they might not have heard of her name or anything like that. But I think once people look up some clips and look her up a little bit, I think they're going to be excited about her just how we were.
Yeah, exactly like you said with her athleticism too, because she's like to me like she has like a solid first step and stuff, but she's like a very non-traditional like good athlete. Like when
Mm-hmm.
you have somebody her size that's like almost 6 foot that can get skinny around screens like that and like just move the way she does,
Yeah.
just super uncommon. Like there are
Yeah.
not players like that who are like have like legit wing size that can really move. So it's
Yeah.
I'm excited about her. She's gonna be
Me
fun.
too. We are too,
Um
for sure.
yeah, from like a pure like just like being in the draft room perspective too. What is that like? How do you I am not a person who handles anticipation well. I just like getting things over with so I know what's going on. So how was draft room experience just as a whole?
It's good. You do a lot of prep work. And it's like, especially like, our first pick was the 10th pick, right? So
Hmm.
you can have in your mind who you want, but they could be gone, right? Easily. It's kind of hard and we do mock drafts and who we project, but it's hard to really know who's going to be there when it's your time to pick. So it's just, we do a lot of preparation leading up to it. So like we have, okay, these are our first choice. This is the next choice. Or if this person's there, if this position's there, who we're going to take. So we like spend a lot of time going through like as many possibilities as possible. And then so sometimes if you get there, like, well, we didn't really end up needing to do all that, but you just want to make sure that you're as prepared as possible. So you hopefully don't get surprised, but there is a little anticipation because you just kind of have to wait and see how things shake out. But I think the preparation helps us feel like, okay, if this goes left, right, and not what we were thinking, we have a plan that we feel pretty good about, or that like we have consensus about that we're going to go with. So I think the more planning that you can do, I think that helps it. And I think it makes being in the draft room a little bit more enjoyable and not as stressful because
Yeah.
again, you've planned it out, you've talked it through, or there's a delay from like when you make your picks to what's on TV, right? So it's like we have time, right? We meet hours before the draft, we meet days before. So it's like we've had time to really talk it through, kind of if there's any disagreements, work it out, watch a lot of film, pull up clips, look at analytics. So it's so much info that we're looking at. It does make you feel a little bit better in your decision. But a lot of you just kind of have to wait and see what other teams are thinking, which is not always kind of the way that you would think about it. So it makes it a fun element as well to see kind of how other teams and their perspective on certain players too.
Definitely. Yeah. Obviously, I'm not expecting you to say who, but was there anything that did surprise you yesterday? Like, was there a moment where you're like, wow, okay, was not really anticipating that?
Yeah, for sure. I won't
Yeah.
say who,
Yeah,
but
definitely.
definitely surprised at a certain point, for sure.
Okay, yeah, that makes two of us. One last thing I do want to close out on too. Obviously, what you guys did at UConn incredibly well documented. I think it goes without saying, two undefeated seasons, which especially watching South Carolina, this was my first year, second full year like covering college basketball, and like so getting to watch South Carolina do that just gives me that
Mhm.
much more of a like, wow, how does anybody go undefeated for an entire year? Um, but like, how do you kind of take that and coming over as an athlete to the W and now obviously being in the front office, like how do you take that and kind of come down from it is the wrong way to put it, but like I
Mm.
feel like it would be very difficult to lose one game across the course of 3 seasons and then be on a team that goes like 20 and 10. Like 20 and 10 is still
Yeah,
good, but like, when you have a standard
yeah,
like that and you're so used to that, how do you kind of get used to like a different level of competition like that? Obviously, you guys played a ton of very,
yeah.
but yeah.
It took time. Like I would say when I came in as a rookie and like my first 2 years with Connecticut, we didn't make the playoffs.
Mhm.
And it was so funny. Not at the time, it's funny looking back where again, we weren't losing many games. My last year, we didn't lose a game. Now, I will say at UConn, we might not have lost games, but the coaches did a very, very, I want to say good, but at the time it didn't feel good
Yeah.
job of like keeping us very level headed, right? Like at the end of the day, sometimes it wasn't about I mean, always we wanted to win, but it wasn't necessarily questioning if we were going to win or not. It was more of like, what are the goals that were set for us, and did we reach them, or did we play the way that we wanted to play, right? So we could win. I remember we won games by 40, 50 points, and you get in the locker room and it feels real negative, and you're like,
Yeah.
dang, I know we won, but like it doesn't feel like we won. So we kind of got knocked down back to earth pretty consistently. But then I think when we left and went pro, like I remember we were dropping games left and right, and I would get so upset in the locker room, and then I'm like, how are we losing, right? Why isn't everybody mad that we're losing? And they're like, all right, where are we going to eat, right? Like we'll be like, and they're like, we're gonna play again tomorrow, right? Like it's not the end of the world if you lose a game. So some of it, I think, you get used to not winning every game, right? Like it just takes time to get used to that. And then I went my second year, I went overseas to China, and I loved my team. My teammates were so great, but we won we were like 3-30 something. Like it was
Hmm.
crazy. Like, but at the end of the day, it's like you realize and you learn it's not the end of the world if you lose a game, right? It's not the end of the world if your team's not great. So then I think you do get your perspective shifts a little bit, where it's like, all right, what we did at UConn was very special and it was great, but it's rare, right? So when you're in it, it doesn't feel rare because you're in it, right? And you're doing it. It's your reality. But I think the further you get away from it, and when you step away from it, you understand that's not the norm, right? And that's not normal. And it's not such a bad thing if that's not happening. So it's kind of like you just have to get socked in the mouth a little bit to be like,
Yeah.
all right, this is what losing feels like. It's nobody enjoys it, but it's not, the world's not ending if you lose games. But I do think it makes you appreciate the time that we had there. And I think the further I've gotten away and I look back, I'm just realizing how special it was, and what we were able to do was, it wasn't common and it wasn't a happenstance. And, obviously our coaches, the staff, the players, like all the work, like that was a really special group and special teams over those years. So I think it makes you, reminisce and just appreciate it. And it also taught us a lot. So I think there's a lot of things that you learn from it that you just take. But I think we realized that. I think fans have realized that too, that it's like, all right, like again, it's not the end of the world. You can still be a good team, but you just have to get used to it a little bit. And I think you can take that with off the court as well, right? Like you're not always going to be perfect. Things aren't going to go how you plan. You could work really, really hard on something and it ends up being crappy or it doesn't work out. Like, so I think you just appreciate the times when it feels great and it's super amazing and you're getting undefeated seasons and winning championships, but you understand that's not how it's going to be all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, especially too, like now, I mean, so much of being in front office is keeping the long-term vision and picture.
Mm-hmm.
So like how is that an adjustment too? Because you go from like, all right, game by game, like just taking a game by
Yeah.
game, one game at a time, to like, okay, well now I have to keep everything in vision a little bit. Like, how do you kind of go about that? Because I feel like that's got to be a big adjustment.
Yeah, luckily I'm not the only one, and our
Yeah.
GM has to do that, and he's the one responsible for it, right? So I get to just be like the help. But I think it just takes time to shift it, and I still feel like I'm taking time to figure it all out, right? I'm only in my second year doing this on this side of things, and I think you try to take it day by day, but again, I think a lot of it is preparation and planning. Like you can't predict everything. You can't know how something's going to work out. Sometimes you just kind of have to like step out on faith and hope that it works out. But I think you look at trends in the past, right? You look at history and kind of how things have happened over the years. You take it with a little bit of grain of salt because you never know what's going to happen in the future. But I think you try to do a lot of prep. And for me, it's trying to get as much information as possible. So it's like, even if you have way more information than what you need, sometimes I think I feel better with more long-term, vision outlook if I feel like I'm informed and I have the information or I have the right people to ask. So I think it's, from one thing I've learned, and I do take it from basketball, right? It's like
Mhm.
when I took the job in the front office, the one thing that was really hard for me was like, well, how do I become good at my job,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, how do I get better in an office, right? Like I knew as a basketball player, you want to get better, get in the gym, spend some time in the gym, work on your game, work on these different things. And so now that looks very different, but that's kind of what I've tried to adopt. It's like, I want to be the best front office executive I can be. So it's like, I have to first identify what are the things that I'm doing, right? That took a minute to figure out what I got to do. I was a little overwhelmed, but then it's like I try to figure out what are ways that I can learn how to be better and learn how to do, because that makes me feel like, all right, if I can keep adding to my little front office toolbox and get better at these things, like, and prepare and get the info, I feel a little bit more confident in my more long-term vision and planning. So it's definitely still a work in progress, but I feel like that's just kind of how I've tried to tackle it. And luckily, I'm supported by such great staff, really great leadership, and bosses that help me do that quite a bit.
Yeah, no, I love that. I'm excited to see you keep growing. I'm excited to see how you guys keep moving as a team and organization.
Thank you.
Should be a really exciting year ahead. Morgan, I really appreciate your time. To everyone listening, thank you for listening. Of course, keep up with everything the Sun are doing. And most importantly, have a great rest of your day.